This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Shawn Powers and I talk with Jonathan Corbett of LWN. That's Linux Weekly News. He's been doing this since the 90s. It is a brilliant publication. He is deeply involved in everything having to do with Linux and the kernel, especially, and what's going on with C versus Rust and conservatism in the system and how the whole Linux kernel community works. It's deep stuff. It could not be more important, and that is coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 700, recorded Wednesday, September 28th, 2022. The Linux kernel gets rusty. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Collide. That's Collide with a K. Collide is an endpoint security solution built around honest security. You can meet your security goals without compromising your values. Visit collide.com/floss to learn more and activate a free 14-day trial today. No credit card required. And by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies. Hosted by Bridget Todd, this season of IRL looks at AI in real life. Search for IRL in your podcast player. Hello again, everybody, everywhere in the world. I am Doc Searls, and this is FLOSS Weekly, and I am joined this week with a very verdant-looking and perhaps not sounding Shawn Powers. There he is.
Do I sound green?
So he's making trouble lately by dyeing his hair green and wearing his green shirt, which I noted earlier to people eavesdropping on our back channel. Makes him look like a Celtics fan, which I am, but he's probably not. I don't think he gives a damn, really. Do you?
I have a cat named Larry Bird.
Oh, really? Wow.
I do. Yeah.
That's cool. I like that.
See? You didn't expect that.
Has he or she eaten birds? I used to have wild cats that would bring them home to me. You know, they bring back a pre-masticated robin or something and lay it at my feet and look up and go row, like, because I'm the alpha cat, and you would appreciate that.
Why don't you eat this? I mean,
yeah, exactly. I'll take it. So, and it's interesting because I'm wearing a purple shirt and you're wearing a green one. There's just something to that, maybe, as a non-theme.
Put us together and we are the Joker,
yeah, and it almost looks like team. Maybe like team colors. So our guest today is Jonathan Corbett, who I've not known personally very well, but have known his work for a very long time, and with LWN, Linux Weekly News, which is persistent and authoritative and complete as can be. So have you kept up with that? I mean, we were both with Linux Journal.
And that's actually funny.
Up until. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I mean, and I'll talk more when he's here too. But it's funny. My relationship with LWN is. I'll wait until he's on with us. But I purposefully tried not to go there for all of my information because it felt like cheating. So.
because of Linux Journal.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
suppose. I went there because I would cheat. That's a great way to cheat. But anyway, so let's get into it. It's probably the first time he's heard himself referred to that way. Our guest today is Jonathan Corbett. He's the kernel documentation maintainer, co-founder of LWN.net. Please go there, and the author of its kernel page, a member of the Linux Foundation's technical advisory board, the lead author of Linux Device Drivers 3rd Edition, lives in Boulder, Colorado, and there's so much more going on than that. Jonathan, welcome to the show. There he is, visibly.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Are those books behind you mostly tech, or mostly Linux related? Or are they bound volumes of LWN, or what?
No, they're mostly science fiction, actually. And then you can see things like Edward Tufte up in the corner over there. The tech books are off to the side where you don't see them, but where I can reach them without getting out of my chair.
Yeah. There's you could always tell back when they still had people worked in offices and they had cubicles. could tell who the hackers were by all of the O'Reilly books on the shelf in their cubicle. There was that. I don't think they tried to hide them, but arm's length was how that went. Yeah. So you were. I wonder, do you rely on print that much, or would you rather go online for your wisdom on that stuff? That's just an off the wall question, not one I was prepared with, but it came to me.
I still occasionally go to the print books, usually for things like if I have to figure out something with SQL. I mean, SQL is not my area and it hasn't changed much, so I'll go get my SQL book. For current stuff, you generally want to go online anymore. And so I haven't bought a lot of books in recent times. I think a whole lot of other people haven't either.
Yeah, well, that's, O'Reilly still seems to be alive and they have subscriptions going. And let's go into that for a second, because something I've noticed lately is that everybody wants a paywall. You go online and you click on the Atlantic, you click on the New York Times, you click on lots of sources, and they they'll either give you very little or they give you nothing and they tease you and go to a paywall. You've actually had a paywall publication for a very long time, so you're ahead of the game there, and you've probably been ahead of it. Has that been the case from the start, that LWN has been subscription only? I don't think it was.
No, it is not.
When it wasn't. Tell us about that journey.
LWN was actually not meant to be the focus of what we were doing. Me and my friend Liz Coolbaugh, a longtime compatriot, we wanted to start a consulting business around Linux because it was about 1996, 97 when we were thinking about this. And we thought this Linux thing might be going somewhere. So we were going to make a consulting business and I guess mostly focused on system administration and such, but we didn't really have all that strong an idea of what we were going to do. But we did know that we needed to draw attention. So LWN was our attention getter. It was the way that we were going to show the world just how current we are and how much we knew about the Linux world. And since we were keeping up with the Linux kernel mailing list, which was all of 100 messages a day in those days, and nobody else could possibly keep up with that. So we could share our work with the community and at the same time draw attention we thought would surely lead to lots and lots of business. It didn't, but it did definitely lead to a lot of attention to LWN. And so we eventually pivoted over to that. We initially wanted to do it as an advertising supported thing because that's what everybody was doing back in 1998 or so when we were making these decisions. And then the .com thing hit and the sort of Linux wave at the very end of the .com boom hit us, and we got acquired briefly by a company that wanted to use us as sort of a piece of their Linux core portal, because in those days everybody was going to make their money by having the online portal for Linux and open source software. And of course that didn't last very long either, and in 2002 we were cast out on our own again, and we tried the ad-supported thing again for a bit, and trying to make a living as an ad-supported website in 2002 really just didn't work very well for anybody who was doing it. So we initially decided to just throw in the towel, and then our readers started throwing money at us and saying, you should really do this as a subscription-oriented thing. So I went and hacked on the site code for a while, and it's actually almost exactly 20 years ago now that I think about it. It was in September that we launched as a subscription-supported site.
I'm wondering. It's interesting to me that your readers led you to that. It's funny because I would follow the LKML, the Linux kernel mailing list, a lot. The only code I know is Morse, so I didn't know a lot too much of what they were actually talking about in many cases, but I enjoyed watching how it all moved. But what you had with LWN was like more than an accessory to that. It was an amazing companion. And I'm wondering if you thought of it that way, that the two kind of went hand in hand.
Well, we obviously tried to go along with what was going on in the community and to try to make that community activity more accessible to a wider range of people. Because even back at the beginning, the volume of the traffic was hard, even for people in the center of the community to follow, much harder if you weren't really current with what was going on and what the people there were talking about. So we wanted to make it accessible to the wider world, and I think hopefully we've succeeded in doing that over the decades since then. But yeah, that was our goal.
I do have a question, and specifically, I would like to know all of your secrets. No, not really. What I'm curious about is you manage to get all sorts of information, and I have a unique understanding of how difficult it is to come up with pertinent, relative, interesting, timely information on a regular basis. And so I'm a little bit curious how you go about procuring all of the information that goes into LWN. However, before you answer, Doc, do you want to tell us about something? Or do you want to tease that?
I was just trying to, what we just a little detail in how we work here. We have several ads during the show, and so we decide how do we want
Shawn
to tease what comes after the next ad or whatever. So just go.
Then let me pretend I didn't say anything. You can edit that out if you want after the fact. So Jonathan, how is it that you get the bulk of your information? And the reason that I'm curious, one, I'm not going to be stealing your thunder at this point. Back when I wrote for Linux Kernel every month, I had to come up with like half a dozen interesting stories, and that was a challenge. You do more than that. It must be a challenge. I'm just curious how you manage to get so much information. Is it all you? Do you have a team of people that are nerdier than any of us that just scour the internet looking for information?
I mean, it's not just me. We're currently down at a relatively low-level staff with exactly 2 people. I'm very much looking to hire writers, by the way, should anybody wish to enter into this life of intrigue and adventure. In terms of gathering information, what we do for the most part is follow the public discussions. We really work from public sources almost exclusively. We don't have people sneaking us information from behind corporate firewalls or anything like that. We just don't operate that way. So my main way of operating, especially in the kernel community, is to subscribe to several dozen mailing lists, not just Linux kernel. And I've developed ways of working through them very quickly to try to pick out the discussions that would make interesting topics. And usually with that, finding topics isn't that hard to do. It's more a matter of narrowing it down to the ones that can actually be dealt with in a timely sort of way. We do also, watch websites and all that, and try to follow some discussions happening in discourse servers and online forums and all that sort of thing. The movement of discussions to online forums is actually making our life a whole lot harder because they are much harder to follow than a mailing list is, especially if you spent decades developing a lot of tools that help you follow mailing lists in a quick way. But without NNTP and GNews and a few things like that, it would be a whole lot harder.
So we have you gave us a great tease right there with the intrigue and adventure line. So I have some questions about that, but first I have to let people know this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Collide. That's Collide with a K. IT admins often feel like they have to choose between their commitment to cybersecurity and their duty to protect the employee's privacy. Naturally, you need to safeguard company data against hacks and breaches, but you don't want to turn your workplace into 1984. Traditional MDMs give the IT team complete access and control over company devices, but since employees are inevitably going to use their work laptops for personal activities, these tools can saddle you with surveillance capabilities you never wanted, like access to photos and browser history. So before you know it, your end users are complaining about all the security agents slowing down their laptops. Developers are frustrated by a lack of autonomy. People start secretly working on their own personal devices just to get things done. It's easy to fall into the trap of top-down security, but that's not the only option. Collide is an endpoint security solution built around honest security. Their philosophy is that employees aren't your biggest security risk, they're your biggest allies. And your relationship with them should be based on transparency and informed consent. Collide works by notifying your employees of security issues via Slack, educating them on why they're important, and giving them step-by-step instructions on how to resolve them themselves. For IT and security teams, Collide provides the right level of visibility for Mac, Windows, and Linux devices, and it addresses high-risk issues that can be solved through brute force or automation. What's more, your end users can see exactly why and how each piece of data is being collected via Collide's User Privacy Center and their open source code base. You can beat your security goals without compromising your values. Visit collide.com/floss to find out how. If you follow that link, they'll hook you up with a goodie bag just for activating a free trial. That's KOLIDE.com/floss. Okay, so Jonathan, you provided us with some really rich and useful background material, including a slide deck you prepared after an event, I think it was in Europe or something like that. Whatever it was, you went into, it seemed to be like the biggest issue in there was Rust and the use of Rust for working on the kernel and where that's going. Do you want to expand on that a little bit? Because the kernel is traditionally developed in C. Rust is coming in. There's a lot of Rust developers out there. It's kind of the hot code base, the hot code right now. So what's going on with that? Especially the adventure and the intrigue. Yeah, I said especially the adventure and the intrigue. We want the juicy bits.
Not necessarily a lot of intrigue there. The kernel has, as you said, been written in the C programming language. There was a brief experiment with C++ way back in the early 90s that didn't work very well at all. It was averted after, I think, just one development release. And it's all been C and assembly ever since then. In recent years, there has been a push to incorporate the Rust programming language. Rust, of course, has its origins in Mozilla some 10 years, a bit more than 10 years ago at this point. They tried to design a programming language that would make it very difficult to write code with many types of common errors. C, of course, makes it very easy to create all kinds of memory safety and other sorts of errors. And we've been doing this sort of backyard action trying to fix these errors for decades in the kernel and in many other software projects as well. The programming language can help with that. It can make sure that you're not accessing memory in ways that will create bugs and security bugs in particular. So a few years ago, a few developers said that Rust would be ideal for use within the kernel. In fact, the Rust developers wanted Rust to be suitable for kernel type developments because in the sense that it should be suitable for low-level development, and in particular, not impose the sorts of performance penalties that other sorts of languages that have managed runtimes to provide memory safety and such impose. So Rust should be suitable for that. These developers have been working in this direction for some time. They've managed to get a bit of corporate support behind that and trying to show that you can, in fact, write kernel modules in the Rust language. This effort has come to a head over the last couple of years. We discussed it at the Kernel Maintainers Summit 1 year ago and pretty much concluded that Rust would be incorporated, it would be allowed into the kernel as an experiment to see how it would go. But that didn't happen over the last year. At the Kernel Maintainers Summit just 2 weeks ago, it was decided that would happen for the 6.1 kernel release. The merge window for 6.1 will be opening in actually just next week. And that kernel release can be expected to happen in December, probably about mid-December. So the initial incorporation of Rust into the kernel would be a pretty minimal sort of thing. The infrastructure will be there. It will be something for people to play with. There will be no production code that people will be running written in Rust at that point. But there are things that are coming. There's some very interesting things, including an NVMe driver that was written in Rust. The Linux kernel already has a very well optimized, well debugged NVMe driver in C. The Rust one was an exercise to see how well that would work in Rust, and they've managed to get performances just slightly short of the kernel's C driver without really even trying all that hard. It was a really spectacular demonstration, I think, of how well this can work. So going forward, we will see what happens with it. There's seems to be a lot of interest from people who would not otherwise be kernel developers on working on the kernel now that Rust is there. I hope it's going to bring a lot of new faces into our community. And I hope that over time, it will show that we can write safer code in a safer language, that we don't have to use C for that kind of programming. So that's kind of where it stands. The experiment is really just beginning in the sense that once it gets into the main line, there's going to be a lot more attention on it, and we'll see a lot more people starting to play with it.
So I'm curious. I'm kind of a big fan of Rust. I'm not a Rust developer at all, but we've interviewed Rust developers here on the show, and just in general, I'm curious: is there any pushback against the idea of introducing Rust into the actual Linux kernel? I mean, that seems like a kind of a huge deal, and I've been around communities long enough to know that communities don't always agree on everything. So is there pushback? And if so, do you think that's going to be an issue, or will people just get on board, or don't you really know?
This is the kernel community. We don't agree on anything. But there is a bit of pushback. You just put up a slide from my talk that there was a post from one longtime kernel developer who actually feels outright insulted by the idea that we need something like Rust to avoid creating bugs in the kernel. Most people, I think, don't feel that way. I think that what I would describe is not necessarily pushback so much as nervousness, because people don't know how well it's going to work in the kernel. I mean, that part we'll see. But if Rust is actually adopted for production kernel code, then we have an awful lot of maintainers with decades of C experience who are now going to have to learn the Rust programming language well enough to review code that is being submitted, well enough to find bugs in it, and to maintain it going forward. And that makes a lot of people nervous, because that's a lot of learning that's going to have to be done. You don't really learn Rust over a weekend. It takes some time to get a handle on it. In fact, I'm still working on it fairly hard. I'm kind of, working my way through the book and all that. But you have to write a fair amount of code, I think, to get a handle on it. And then the interface of Rust to the kernel and the abstractions that are being built to do kernel type things in Rust are yet another thing they're going to have to be learned. So there's going to be a lot of learning that goes on, and the people who are promoting Rust in the kernel, who are pushing it, are going to have to do a lot of hand-holding and support work for quite a while. I think they understand this. I think they're ready for it. They say that they're prepared to do this, but it's going to be an interesting process to watch over the next year or two.
It makes perfect sense to me. And again, nobody has asked me, and nobody should ask me, because my opinion is worth very little. But my experience with Rust, as somebody who's talked to a lot of developers about it, is that it certainly seems to make a lot of sense. And part of its difficulty is also part of its strength, right? It requires you to write really good code, or it just doesn't work right. And again, that's a strength. So I hope that that things move forward smoothly, but you kind of echoed what my suspicions were, in that there are a lot of people who would have to learn a lot in order to make any sort of significant transition, especially in the main kernel itself. So I appreciate that, and that's going to be something that's interesting to watch. And where could we go to follow such a thing? Is there a website that we could possibly subscribe to with regular information? I can imagine one,
yes. I can imagine one. We will definitely be watching it. To sort of finish that out, I described one of the challenges. There is another one, which is that certain things are just hard to do in Rust. one of the core data structures in the Linux kernel is a doubly linked list. We use them everywhere. We have thousands and thousands of these doubly linked lists. And for reasons I could get into, implementing a doubly linked embedded list in the Rust programming language is almost impossible. There was a separate workshop that was held in
Sorry, I was just agreeing with you as I mumbled along. Go ahead.
There was a separate workshop that was held in northern Spain just before the Linux Plumbers Conference and all that I was privileged enough to go to. And a big part of that workshop was trying to deal with the problem of not really even implementing this doubly linked list structure, but just initializing it. How can you initialize it in a way that fits into the Rust programming language and allows developers to write idiomatic Rust and that sort of thing? Because you can always do it by just creating a big unsafe block, but that defeats the purpose of using Rust in the first place. Mm-hmm. So there are going to be some interesting challenges there of where there are some things that Rust just doesn't support very well because it's a use of memory that Rust was, in a sense, almost designed to prevent.
Mm-hmm. So do you find that your involvement with LWN and reporting so regularly on kernel information gives you sort of an inside track on what's going on, or do you just get most of the information that you garner from the listserv, which is like drinking from a fire hose for the kernel listserv, or do you find yourself being one of those inside people that gets not the dirt, gets the rust? No, that doesn't seem right either. Is it just scouring lists, or do you have useful conversations with people who you may not otherwise have those conversations if you weren't so involved with the kernel development community?
Well, my involvement with the kernel development community encompasses both LWN and my actual work directly for the kernel, and both of those certainly bring me a wider awareness of things. On the LWN side, people will send us notes saying, hey, have you seen this discussion over here? You might want to pay attention to what's going on there. And that does help us. And our long involvement with the community does get me invited to events like the Congrejo's Rust and Linux conference in northern Spain, or to the Kernel Maintainers Summit, things like that certainly increase my awareness of what's going on there. And I think also help the community as a whole, because I go there as a participant in the community, not as somebody who's just going there to report on things. So it's a combination of both. It's mostly really just watching what's going on in the community, but it does bring opportunities to see what's happening in the community as well.
I want to probe a little further into the old versus new, the conservatism issue that you brought up in your slide deck there. But first, I have to let everybody know that we have this thing called Club TWiT, and Club TWiT is another great way to support the TWiT network. As a member, you get access to ad-free versions of all the shows on TWiT, as well as other great benefits. There's a bonus TWiT Plus feed, which includes footage and discussions that didn't make it into final show edits, and as well as bonus shows we've started, such as the Giz Fizz, Ask Me Anythings, and fireside chats with some of your favorite TWiT guests and co-hosts. As FLOSS Weekly listeners, you may be interested in checking out the Untitled Linux show. The show is available only to Club TWiT members. So join that. You can sign up to join Club TWiT for just $7 a month. Head over to twit.tv/clubtwit and join today. And we thank you for your support. So one of the most interesting and entertaining things to me, Jonathan, in following the Linux kernel mailing list for so many years, is Linus himself. Like, something comes up and he just sort of smacks things down. And so you mentioned that conservatism was a bit of an issue, and there's one of his posts. He ends. I'm trying to bring it up here with. He says you really need to understand that Rust in the kernel is dependent on kernel rules, and he's emphasizing that, not on some other random rules that exist elsewhere. And I'm wondering to what extent those rules are programmatic, as it were, or are they cultural, or are they both? And is Linus himself like just being a good leader here, or the biggest stick in the mud on the Rust issue?
No, I don't think he's a stick in the mud at all. I think he's been pretty supportive of the idea from the beginning, cautious about it and not wanting to break things. The conversation that you're referring to in particular was a very technical one and had to do with how you deal with failure. The normal application level Rust way to deal with failure is to panic and throw up your hands and say, this isn't working, something has gone wrong, let's just kill the program right there. And for a user space program, that may well be the best thing to do. In the kernel space, you really cannot do that, because if you do it, you kill the system completely. And that makes it really hard for users to even just say recover any work that they had going on. And it makes it really hard to debug any problems that are happening. So a discussion has gone back and forth a few times with the Rust developers has been, what do you do when you can't allocate memory? What do you do when you detect a bug somewhere? And the normal Rust way of throwing a panic is just not something that's acceptable there. You have to find a way to muddle along, if at all possible, and keep the system running so that users can recover from whatever has gone wrong. So that was the topic of that particular discussion there. And I think Linus was entirely right on that point. I don't think that particular discussion relates to conservatism at all. I can certainly tell stories that do if you want. On the Rust side, you can go back to the other quote that you put up before of saying essentially that C has been good enough, it was good enough for my daddy, it's good enough for me. I don't see why it shouldn't be good enough for developers in the future as well. That kind of conservatism. A totally different area, which is one closer to home for me, when I became the documentation maintainer for the kernel. The kernel's documentation directory was really this totally disorganized mess of individual text files. It was, as a previous maintainer said, just a collection of things that random passersby kind of set down in random locations and left there. It was difficult to use at best and full of old and obsolete stuff. One of the first things that we did was to adopt a system called Sphinx, which was designed for the documentation of code. It comes out of the Python community initially. And we wanted to use it to bring some structure to the Linux documentation tree to allow us to create nice HTML documents and all that stuff, which is really almost a secondary concern, but something we wanted to do. The main thing we wanted to do was to impose some structure on our documentation, actually create something coherent, as opposed to several thousand individual ASCII text files that people threw into a directory somewhere. And I ran into incredible amounts of opposition on that. I still am sometimes. There are people who just didn't like restructured text because it imposes a little bit of structure on what is still really just an ASCII text file containing your documentation. There are people who didn't want to reorganize our documentation directory to actually make it more friendly to our readers and try to bring subjects together and to put structure on it. It's a battle that I had to fight for several years. And I think I won it because I think the bulk of the community was really behind doing something better in that regard. I think we have a long way to go, but it's the kind of thing you run into when you try to bring change to a community that has done things the same way for more than 30 years now. I think it's just inherent to the territory, really.
So it's interesting to me that I was around. I just want to stay on Linus for a minute because I actually got some hang time with him during the time that he was writing Git and ditching Bitkeeper, and that was almost an example of where he was not being a conservative. He was the opposite, really. And I suppose he was getting some pushback on that. And it's interesting to me what he leads on and what he doesn't. I don't see him among, the top list of contributors. You have this wonderful list of who's contributed what in the 5.19 kernel. Your stats are always amazing. I just have to say that. but obviously he's still leading in some ways. And I'm wondering, where, I think you made a really good point in saying that this is really one little minor point here that's in a technical issue. So what does Linus's leadership look like now? Obviously he's still very involved. He still looks like the chief poobah, at least to an outsider like me, but I'm not inside. You are inside. You're documenting the whole thing.
All right, let me answer this in a few ways, starting with the Git thing, actually, because we adopted BitKeeper in about 2002. Until then, the Linux community was functioning without a source code management system for over 10 years. If that doesn't really epitomize conservatism and resistance to change, I don't know what does. I mean, that was kind of a very interesting situation in its own right. When we did finally change that, first via BitKeeper and then via Git, we not only changed the way we work, we changed the whole world. And I take that as an example of what we could do in the future, for example, with adoption of Rust and other sorts of development tools. Getting back to Linus in particular, he doesn't write a lot of code these days. That's really not his role, right? His role is to decide what gets into the mainline kernel and to try to steer people as they're developing things in that direction. So you'll often see him most actively during the merge windows, if you watch what he posts in the coming week or two. And you will see somebody come to him with a pull request saying, here is some stuff that needs to go into the 6.1 kernel. And he'll look at it and he'll say, no, I am sorry, this is not acceptable. You can't do it this way. It needs to be done some other way. Now, normally, hopefully this happens before it gets to the pull request point, and he will often participate in discussions to make that happen as well. But that's really his role, is steering things at a high level and making sure that everybody is playing well together. They're pushing in something resembling the same direction, and the work that they come up with by the time it gets to him is acceptable for pulling into the kernel to create a stable production ready kernel at the end of it. So he doesn't author a lot of code, but if you look at merges into the kernel, right? If you look at the merge commits, which I don't normally count, you will see that he is the creator of a vast number of them, because he is the one who is taking the pieces and putting them together to create the whole that we all use as the Linux kernel at the end.
All right, so what I hear is that if I want to get all of the kernel documentation switched from text-based to emoji-based in order to save bits, because you can just say so much more with an emoji. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, my question, though, does lead right off of Linus's handling things. Not me personally, but I've seen discussions where people are concerned that the majority, I believe, of changes going into the kernel are done by people employed by a small number of companies. And that's both good and bad, right? I mean, people are getting paid to develop the kernel, but also there's a concern. Okay, is there any, should we be worried about that? I mean, again, there's clearly vested interest in the kernel being healthy. And so, people getting paid to develop the kernel is ideally what we want. But is there too much concentration of influence, so to speak, by companies?
Well, as far as I can tell, something just over 90% of the people contributing to the kernel are doing that as part of their job. All right. So, kernel development is very much a paid sort of thing. There aren't that many volunteer developers anymore, just because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but among other things, anybody who has any success as a volunteer developer tends not to stay that way very long because people start throwing money at them. But if you look at a typical development cycle, the people who are working on the kernel are working for generally just over 200 and as about 240 different companies. So it's not exactly a small number of companies that are developing the kernel or who are paying the developers to work on the kernel. And generally, the most influential companies will be behind at most maybe 10% of the commits that go into the kernel. Okay. So I really don't think that there's any one company that has undue influence over the kernel. There may be companies that can try to influence in any one particular direction. But in general, when even the biggest companies, the most productive companies, try to influence the kernel in ways that are not healthy for the long term, for the kernel over the long term, they get a lot of pushback and people call them out. Even people working for those companies will call them out for that. Okay. So I think the situation's pretty healthy that way, honestly.
And I appreciate that. And it was the kind of thing I was hoping that's sort of the way that you would answer, because I mean, the concern, it's not necessarily conspiracy theory, right? It's just, there is a concern, like, could somebody hire enough of the prominent kernel developers to buy influence in kernels such that it would benefit their company while, hindering another? And it sounds like maybe the development team is still large enough that that's not necessarily the case, and possibly even self-policing. You said, the company would frown on its own developers for doing such a thing. So that's encouraging. I appreciate that, and I'm glad that we could hear it out loud.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I mean, companies do definitely hire developers to influence how the kernel goes. Most often they want the developers to make the kernel work well on their hardware, for example. It's a good sort of influence. Sometimes there are more subtle things, and there are people involved. There are going to be things that happen there. But there are just over 2,000 developers anymore that contribute to any given kernel development cycle, and something over 4,500 who contribute over the course of the year. So you would have to hire a lot of developers to try to influence the kernel as a whole. The piece of the puzzle that I didn't quite talk about before is maintainers, the people who decide which patches actually get into the kernel. And there are fewer of those, and those work for fewer companies. The last time I looked, the patches getting into the mainline kernel are going through the hands of maintainers that are employed. If you look at about half of the patches going into the kernel are going through maintainers employed by about half a dozen companies. So there is more concentration at that level, and perhaps more potential for trouble there. I think that the real problem there is not that those companies are trying to hire maintainers to influence the kernel. I think the problem there is that companies really tend to be reluctant to pay people to work as maintainers, and that something that a lot of companies could do to help this situation is to make maintainership part of people's job and really pay them for that. I think that's why we see concentration there, is because a lot of companies just aren't willing to do that. They'll pay a developer to write a driver for their device, and then it stops there. But that's really only a part of the problem. So we're perennially short of maintainers, and could really use more resource there.
Oh my gosh, you just opened a rich vein of possible questions in the limited time we have left. So we'll get to at least one of those after I let everybody know that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by IRL, an original podcast from Mozilla. IRL is a show for people who build AI and people who develop tech policies. It's hosted by Bridget Todd, and this season, it looks at AI in real life. Who can AI help? Who can it harm? It features conversations with people who are working to build a more trustworthy AI. These are fascinating in every case. There's an episode about how our world is mapped with AI. The data that's missing from these maps tells as much of a story as the maps themselves. You'll hear about the people who are working to fill in the gaps and take control of the data. There's another episode about gig workers who depend on apps for their livelihood. That one looks at how they're pushing back against algorithms that control how much they get paid and seeking new ways to gain power over data, create better working conditions. For political junkies, there are episodes about the role that AI plays when it comes to the spread of misinformation and hate speech around elections. That's a huge concern for democracies around the world. The latest episode is called the AI Medicine Cabinet. That I just listened to. It goes from Maryland to Rwanda to other places, looking at AI diagnostic systems. One working on Mozilla's Privacy Not Included Buyer's Guide that investigates privacy and security in mental health apps. All kinds of stuff in there. Highly, highly recommend checking that out. Search for IRL in your podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to IRL for their support. So Jonathan, you touched on the human side of this thing, and there's so many ways they could go. One of them is, and it's one you just touched on now. The level of appreciation for the foundational role that Linux and other open source code bases, but especially Linux, because Linux is in nearly everything. It's in the clock I look at up here. It's in all kinds of stuff. It has become the embedded operating system in all the televisions that are, and yet it's interesting to me that companies don't look deep enough to recognize how important this is. I would think that that companies would have lots and lots of gift subscriptions to LWN as well. So what do you think is going on with companies that they don't get the importance that they have? I mean, Linux Journal ended in, at least for us, Shawn and I, in 2019. It's still on the web, but as a functional magazine, it ended then. And in part because of that, there was a time, I remember, IBM, for example, we became friends with Dan Fry there. He ran a division, and he's the one who told me that it took him 6 years to find out that the kernel developers they hired on purpose, Ted Show, for example, we're telling them what to do rather than them telling the kernel maintainers what to do, and had war stories about that. And I notice now that, Meta, which is Facebook, is a big participant now, at least as an employer. And of course, they have a vast pile of Linux machines running, right? As does Google. These are important to the world, and stuff that they need has to show up in the kernel in some ways, and then everybody else gets to benefit from it. But what do you think is there just cluelessness there? Is it too many layers of management? What's the deal?
Well, again, with over 200 companies participate in every kernel development cycle, I don't think I would say that companies are entirely unaware of the importance of it. On the LWN side, we of course sell subscriptions to companies for the employees, and we have a pretty broad representation of companies, including companies in areas like the finance sector that you wouldn't necessarily think are interested in it, but in fact are very interested in what's going on in the Linux kernel for very similar sorts of reasons. So the awareness is there. But the willingness to, first of all, the understanding of how to engage with it and the willingness to engage with it, of course, varies quite a bit. I think there are an awful lot of companies who think they can just grab this software, toss it into something, make use of it, and solve their problem and move on to the next thing. And in fact, a lot of them can. And, it's not what we like to see. We would like to see better participation. But it is also, assuming they follow the license, it's also entirely within their rights. It's what we said they could do with our code. We put it out there with the proviso that they could indeed do exactly that, right? They don't have to. So all we can do is to encourage companies that depend on what we do to participate in it, to help to steer it in the direction they want to go. And companies tend to figure this out over time. They start by just sort of taking it, then they maybe start making demands of developers, and that doesn't go very far. And then they slowly learn that if they work within the community, they can get things to go the way they want them to go, and they can get what they need from Linux in a much better sort of way. And there are people who will try to help them with that. One of the functions of the Linux Foundation's Technical Advisory Board is, in fact, to work with companies that are trying to figure out how to work with the development community, and to talk to them and say, hey, this is what you're doing right, this is what you're doing wrong, you should really be doing this some other way. It's something that we do kind of out of sight, but it is something that we do that I think has helped a lot of companies to become better members of the development community as a whole.
So speaking of being better members, I'm not a developer, and I'm not involved with, especially with any large projects. And so I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of there being fewer maintainers than is ideal, and that the whole nuance between developers and maintainers and that sort of thing is really starting to be above my head as far as comprehension goes. But what would be the motivation, apart from goodwill, for companies to have more interest in the maintaining part that might be lacking diversity of companies, diversity, at all? Is there something that companies are missing? Is it just the goodwill of, the half dozen or so companies involved that are doing it?
Well, I mean, supporting maintainership, of course, very much increases your influence over how things go, and that's something that's best to keep in mind. But really, supporting maintainership is valuable to ensure that the subsystems that you depend on go in a way that will be useful to you going forward. If you say, I don't know, you make web cameras, just since I'm staring at one that comes to mind, then you might want to employ a developer to write a driver so that your webcams work well with Linux, because you want your cameras installed in Android phones, whatever. And if Android, which runs Linux, does not support your camera, it's not going to go there. So that's sort of a minimal level of participation. But you may find that your camera does interesting and strange things that are not well supported by the kernel's video subsystem overall. And in fact, this is happening right now. There's trouble with some camera devices that are not very well supported by the media subsystem in Linux. And so we're starting to see closed source or out of tree drivers being used for that, and that's not good. If we had instead people from the companies involved more active in the maintainership of that subsystem, they know where their product line is going. They know the kinds of things that the subsystem as a whole is going to have to support in the coming years. And they can work to push things in that direction so that when their device comes onto the market, Linux is ready for it. That's really hard to do if you're just trying to contribute drivers. You really have to be working up at higher levels. And you don't necessarily have to be a maintainer to do that, but helping the maintainers and working at higher levels in the subsystem will really help your company in future years if you do that. So that's one reason for companies to participate more at that level.
Cool. I appreciate that. Thank you.
We have a couple more. We have a fairly limited time left here, but I want to ask about diversity. We had that issue with Linux Journal. I mean, our Linux Journal's subscribership basically rounded to 100% male in its time, and an oddity about that is that our management was 100% female, and actually at a point our ownership was as well, at least as I recall. And this isn't, when you're looking at developers and maintainers, you can't run an affirmative action program very easily, I don't think, or something like that. I don't know what the method would be. Because these things aren't just social. They're largely technical, and they're what people get obsessed with when they're in high school or later. A lot of it is just purely circumstantial. You're dealing with a very, very small population as well. I mean, these are not, as part of the whole human population. These are wizards. They all went to their own Hogwarts, as it were, and the LKML in a way is something at a Hogwarts of a sort. And how you get in there is just by writing great code. That's something that Linus himself has said over and over again when he's been sort of busted on this issue. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that. How can, what can be done, and who does it, if anything? I don't know. It's really deeply weird that it's almost 100% male on those lists.
It's a really hard question. People have been doing things. There have been mentorship programs such as Outreachy and the Community Bridge program within the Linux Foundation and such that have tried to help in this regard. I don't know. It's hard to say how successful they have been. A lot of the people who go through those programs seem to disappear afterwards. They may well be working as kernel people, but inside companies where you don't see them. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect, I think, is role models. And at times, many of us have tried to draw attention to the role models that we have by, drawing attention to some of the, of the non-basic white male nerdy kernel developers that we have. We did at the Linux Plumbers Conference a few years ago, we did a kernel developers panel, which is something we often do. You get a bunch of developers up there to talk about kernel issues. And without telling anybody, without advertising and such, we put it together as an all-female panel just to put some people up there and say, these people are out there, they're doing interesting stuff, they're thriving in this community. This is something that we would like more people to try to emulate. We then got complaints about the diversity of the panel, that sort of thing. The other aspect of this has been the whole idea that the development community is hostile to not just say female developers, but a whole lot of people who don't want to participate in what is seen as a very Wild West sort of development environment on the kernel mailing list. I think that people are still thinking about a 1990s version of the kernel mailing list. It's really not what it was back then, but it is still a place where you have to be willing to go out there, have your ideas challenged, and be willing to defend them. And perhaps not everybody wants to have their ideas challenged in quite that way. I don't know that that's really, I don't want to say that this is a gender-linked sort of thing or any other sort of metric you want to say, but there are people who hold this up as an impediment to people joining our community. And we've tried to be better in that regard and are continuing to do so, but no doubt have a ways to go yet.
So I just gotta highlight again, you were called out for not having enough dudes on the panel.
On the all-female panel.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's. I mean,
well, it's
I smirk and laugh, but it's a little frustrating that would be the case. So I think great on you guys for doing that. I mean, that's great on you guys. Listen to me. I mean, even it's so ingrained in my psyche that it's mostly men. So kudos to the group for arranging an all-female panel. I think that's awesome, and it's unfortunate that it didn't go over well.
Well, I think it did, but you always get complaints.
Oh, okay. Squeaky wheels. So not the whole.
You get complaints
group,
anyway, I suppose, about anything. And there is diversity in terms of geographical distribution and cultures and things like that. There's a fair amount of that, but the lack of women is kind of huge. You mentioned something that the Linux Foundation is doing, and the Linux Foundation is looming larger and larger in the Linux world, and in fact, in many other worlds, all sorts of adjacent free and open software worlds. They have a really interesting way of moving into noticing a topic. And recently, they had a press release on the intent to form a foundation. They spawn foundations like fish or something that was on wallets. Wallets is coming up as something that the Linux Foundation is going to be interested in, but it's a new kind of organization. We've not seen its like before. I don't know to what extent Linux itself has had an influence on that, but you're involved with the LF, and we've had many people with the LF on the show. We had Brian Bellendorf on a couple of weeks ago. So, and what are your thoughts about that? And because you've been somewhat involved with it, and with the role of the LF.
Yeah, and I serve on their technical advisory board, which is really meant to represent the kernel community's interests to the Linux Foundation. So that's my main involvement with them these days, and I've spoken at a lot of their conferences. From the point of view of the kernel community, I think the LF's involvement has been very positive, in that they've given some developers like Linus Torvalds a place to live that's free of the influence of any given company, that sort of thing. They took over kernel.org after the security issues we have there and have managed to run that infrastructure for us very nicely. They've supported travel for a lot of developers to conferences, that sort of thing. So I think, and they've been running this mentorship program as well. So I think that I believe their participation has been positive. The Linux Foundation makes a lot of people nervous. It does seem to be intent on rapid growth to perhaps a greater extent than I would like, but it's not my organization. That's fine. They can run it the way they like. There are people who would really like to see the LF do things that it was not made to do, like, for example, promote GPL license enforcement, things like that. That is really just not going. It's just something they're not going to do because that's not really at the top of the list for the people who are in the end supporting it, which are large companies working in the Linux area. Right? They're there to make kernel development work well and various other projects work well. And I think they help with that. They can never be the only organization that's working in this area. But I mean, again, I think their involvement is positive. That's why I continue to be involved with them.
So we're at the end of our hour here, maybe even a little past it as I look at my clock, old-fashioned one with a sweep second hand. Every time you see me looking up, that's what it is. Just a quick one. Are there any questions we haven't asked that you'd like us to have asked? And then I have a final two brief ones.
I don't know. You could have asked me, how can I apply to work as a writer for LWN? In which case I would say, look at the Write For Us link on the LWN front page and go there. I won't go for that other than say that I really am looking for people who would like to be a part of this exercise going forward. If you feel that you can write the sort of stuff that we do, please contact me.
That's great. We always close the plugs, generally for our own stuff, but that's a great one. Thank you for that. The last two questions are: what are your favorite text editor and scripting language? We asked everybody that.
Favorite. I mean, I do most of my work in Emacs, but I'm also. I mean, I've used VI since about 1981 or so, and know it very well, and often use it in places where I don't want to fire up Emacs. So the way I put it is, I tend to run VI when I'm running as root, and Emacs when I'm doing everything else.
That's a first. That's good.
For
bilingual that way.
Scripting languages, I mean, I use Python pretty heavily for all that. The LWN site is written in Python, and when I need something to bash something out, that's what I reach for.
To bash something out, you use Python?
Yeah, I didn't. That was unintentional. Yes.
That's great. Well, it has been great having you on the show, Jonathan, and we'll have to have you back when 6.0 comes out, I think, or maybe shortly after that to catch us up on. Is it next week? Okay. Maybe happy to come back next week.
He did say after. Didn't say how long.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it next week? Wow. For some reason I thought it was later. But then you would know. I'm not.
I would.
Yeah, I appreciate the insight.
It comes out on Sunday.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation because, well, I mean, Linux is the core of my career. The actual kernel development stuff is something I'm not heavily involved in. So I appreciate the insights today.
Well, it has been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks again. So, Shawn.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like
good.
I said, it was really great to talk about the Linux kernel with somebody who actually knows what's going on and what's going on currently, and has a grasp of that community. Which, I mean, it's public, but it's not well known. I don't know what I'm going for there. It's kind of mystic, and it's not something that is easy to get involved with unless it's absolutely what you do for a living. And so having an insider's look on things is great. And I'll be honest, I didn't talk too much about it, but I had to try really hard not to just go to LWN to come up with ideas for Linux Journal when I was writing every month, because it just didn't feel right. So I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I did what I did, but I'm also glad LWN is still there. So
I always thought it was just fabulously informative and very straightforward. And I like the simple HTML in it and on the website. So I have to let everybody know that next week we have David P. Reed on. David Reed is one of the fathers of the internet. He's one who came up with the Reed's Law about networks. He was one of the primary authors, the three authors actually, of the end-to-end design in systems. And end-to-end is actually what we have with the internet. So he's one of the architects of the internet. He is a very original thinker, very smart guy, and he's a good friend too. So he's coming up next week. So, Shawn, a plug before we go?
Just the same as always, YouTube channel, blog, ShawnPowers.com with the 0 for the O. Oh yeah, there's me. Literally I'm wearing that shirt. I wrote that this morning. So
okay.
I promise I have other shirts. It's literally from today. So, yeah.
Okay. So great. Thanks everybody. David P. Reed next week. Come back for that. And until then, I'm Doc Searls. This is FLOSS Weekly. See you later.
The world is changing rapidly. So rapidly, in fact, that it's hard to keep up. That's why Micah Sargent and I, Jason Howell, talk with the people making and breaking the tech news on Tech News Weekly every Thursday. They know these stories better than anyone, so why not get them to talk about it in their own words? Subscribe to Tech News Weekly and you won't miss a beat every Thursday at TWiT.tv.